A long time ago, a time we now call the 90s, Marvel Studios as we know them were far from the lucrative financial position they are in today. Famously, in 1999, they sold the Spider-Man film rights to Sony for a mere $7 million, which now seems comically low and something they're still dealing with today. But 5 years prior to that, exactly 30 years ago actually, 20th Century Fox bought the rights to the X-Men and other related characters for a measly $2.6 million. That's what Wikipedia tells me at least. 25 years and 13 movies later, not including 3 not-so-fantastic 4 movies, Disney, now owning Marvel Studios, bought 21st Century Fox for the $70-odd billion, thus regaining the rights to those characters. Cut to 5 years later, with inklings and sprinkles of integrating the X-Men and other various characters throughout phases 4 and 5, we are about to see the first true feature film iteration of those previously Fox-owned characters into the mainline MCU with Deadpool and Wolverine. And depending on your choice of scooper on X, we may be seeing just about every Marvel character in non-MCU history show up. If not here, then probably in the eventual not-so-secret Secret Wars. So what better time to revisit these 13 movies one last time and rank them worst to best, because that's apparently what we do on this channel most in one form or another. Don't worry, the next one won't be. 7 X-Men movies, 3 Wolverine spin-offs, 2 Deadpools, whatever the New Mutants was, spread across an unknown number of timelines, one last time before the new continuity makes its mark. Because there's some damn good movies in here and I want to talk about them. But speaking of wanting to talk about things, number 13 is certainly not one of them. You and everyone else watching this video knew this was here. It's X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's the only one of these I didn't bother to rewatch. We all know what's wrong with it and we have promptly moved on. I don't want to talk about it and you don't want to hear me talk about it, so let's just move along to number 12, where we have Dark Phoenix. A movie so bad, they dropped the X-Men title from some of the marketing. It suffers from a number of things, and one of the most blatantly obvious being that nobody wants to be here. Most notably the cast, but I'd extend that to pretty much everyone involved, including the costume designers, because what happened to the suits from the last movie? By this 4th entry in the reboot franchise, this iteration of the core cast had been at it for nearly a decade. This was probably the last movie on their contracts. Everyone's a lot more famous since First Class. Hell, the Fox Disney deal had already gone through. It was the most, well, we made it, we might as well release it kind of movie possible, but we'll get to the New Mutants in a bit. You can see it in the acting, the writing, and especially in the lower effort Mystique makeup and the fact that she gets killed off in the first act because Jennifer Lawrence clearly did not want to sit there for hours every day getting painted blue, and honestly, I don't blame her at all. In fairness, the movie does attempt some newer things, such as mutants being more accepted in society, Charles acting as more of a celebrity, Magneto's mutant refuge island, but it's all too late because none of those aspects can be explored in conflict with the Phoenix Saga and its awful power blabbering villains. Taking away Jessica Chastain's ginger hair may be this movie's worst crime of all. This lateness and rushing and stuffing of things is actually where a lot of the movie's problems arise from. It's something I've just now decided to call the Skyfall Spectre dilemma, and it could also potentially be applied to the MCU Spider-Man franchise, depending on what happens next. So at the end of Skyfall, Daniel Craig's Bond in a way becomes Bond, if he wasn't already. He has the Aston Martin DB5. Moneypenny is at the desk. M is a stoic Ray Fiennes type. He has Q. The traditional Bond as you know him is finally here, and we can have 3 more movies with this true Bond. Then you get the Spectre, and only now can we introduce Blofeld as his arch nemesis. And I understand there was a legal issue with the actual Spectre name and characters, but then suddenly the movie is unsuccessful because you were planning 4 movies instead of 1, and your plans fall through. This view of planning 4 movies ahead has led many franchises to a similar fate. As for Spider-Man, this kind of happens in each of his 3 movies. At the end of Homecoming, oh, now he's Spider-Man. Far From Home, oh no, now he's definitely Spider-Man. And if it weren't obvious enough by now, at the end of No Way Home, he's definitively Spider-Man. But this franchise still has all the potential to avoid the Skyfall Spectre dilemma. How this applies to Dark Phoenix is actually back in X-Men Apocalypse, that the ending of that is exactly like Skyfall. The X-Men are now finally the X-Men. The suits, the roster, the bald head professor, and the movie ends. And by so many circumstances, we now have only 1 movie left where to actually use this team, and at the same time you're wanting to tell a cohesive Dark Phoenix saga, and that's a hopeless scenario. Because there are scenes in this movie where the X-Men are X-Menning, at least somewhat akin to what we saw in X-Men 97, and they're not bad scenes. Well, some of them. They just had to take out the best part of the last movie in Quicksilver. It also doesn't help that they had to reshoot the entire third act because it was too similar to Captain Marvel. At least it gave us this shot of Magneto. Dark Phoenix is a perfect disaster where everything came together to create the worst product possible under so many circumstances. Retreading so much that was already done in The Last Stand and ultimately better, not having any time to explore ideas and plots or use the X-Men team that you just spent 3 movies setting up to its true form. Dark Phoenix has the untimely honor of being the worst X-Men team movie. And speaking of X-Men Apocalypse setting Dark Phoenix up for failure, at number 11 we have exactly that. The funny thing is, I actually remember enjoying this movie at some point, but that might have been me endlessly rewatching the Quicksilver scene on YouTube over the years, because that is the best scene of the film and one of the few good things going for it, with Quicksilver being the best part of the film in general. Speedsters are always my favorite characters in these things, and if you pair that with Evan Peters' portrayal and energy, he's by far the coolest mutant. And he's a far more significant part of this film than his extended cameo in Days of Future Past, which is a great improvement on that film, because what the fuck happened with everything else? We'll get to Days later on, but these two films are night and day in quality. The best place to start is with the titular character himself. I'm an awful source on all things comics, having really only read 2, but my understanding is that this guy is quite a significant and recurring villain for the X-Men. They're going to be trying again in season 2 of X-Men 97 as teased for the end of season 1, and I'm very much looking forward to that because I can see a lot of potential in it, of which none was on display here. Oscar Isaac's first foray as an ancient Egypt-based Marvel character was far from his fault, as he wasn't given much to work with at all. Whatever they did to his voice didn't help much either.
But you can never strike God!
For the most part, he comes off as a blundering fool, just spouting nonsense about no more weapons, compared to another big colorful guy like Thanos, who is meticulously written and excellently portrayed. To the movie's credit, this exchange is utterly perfect.
Who the fuck are you?
From his design to his writing and eventual defeat, there's little to be redeemed about Apocalypse. And while a movie is often only as good as its villain, Apocalypse himself is not the only thing wrong with this movie. The younger versions of many of the core X-Men are fine, given this is their first appearance in this continuity, but they're not given anything to do. They're background fillers at best. Even Storm as one of the Horsemen is mostly forgettable. But at least they're able to acknowledge the quality of their own movie.
Well, at least we can all agree the third one's always the worst.
Until Dark Phoenix, that is. And even everything that's given to the 4 carryovers from the last 2 entries is extremely subpar. The strength of these movies have always lied in the relationship between Charles and Eric and their clashing ideologies and the actors that portray them. If you can get that part of the movie right, that's already a major factor. And Magneto, being my favorite character in these movies, like he is for most people, is reduced to a henchman who sits in this little bubble for the entirety of the third act. As for Charles, the movie does at least start off with him in professor mode, teaching classes, meeting with Scott, stuff we saw in First Class, and it's great. Then later on, he gets Professor X'd and taken out of the action, and he kind of has to sit there in the dream fight and eventually lose his hair as he becomes the true Professor X. I couldn't tell you anything about their arcs in this movie other than Magneto gets put through another misery storyline because he just hasn't suffered enough, has a movie-long heel turn, and he's good again, and Charles thinks a little harder than the blue guy. Other things I don't love, part of the team gets trapped at the Alkali facility, which feels like a big extended sequence just to have Wolverine show up and do some hack and slash. Did we need that? We could have cut a good bit of runtime. The action sequences are fine. I of course enjoy Quicksilver's bits most, and Magneto teaming up with the X-Men is always welcomed, although that big X he sticks in front of Apocalypse is way too corny, even for me, but I'll let it slide. In short, Apocalypse, for a multitude of reasons, is a failure of an X-Men movie, largely due to its writing, especially in the character development sense, in that the supposedly world-devouring villain turns into comic relief every time he opens his mouth. At number 10, we have a film that at one point I was convinced was never going to be released. A large number of you maybe even haven't heard of this one. The first trailer for The New Mutants debuted in October of 2017, and after a multitude of delays, reshoots, change of greater cinematic universe trajectory, $70 billion acquisitions, a pandemic, the movie somehow released in August of 2020, and you know what? It's not that bad. It's not exactly good, but it's right in that meh middle. I'm gonna call it mid. On the surface, it's not an awful pitch, a horror movie set in an asylum, it just happens to be mutants. That could be a perfectly serviceable entry in the X-Men universe because it did have more concrete ties at some point with Professor X and Storm due to appear. But even taking out the X-Men ties, it works as a little horror movie. It's not a very good horror movie, but it works. It's got a decent cast, with Anya Taylor-Joy doing her best impression of a Russian accent, and some of the powers on display aren't that bad either. Jonathan from Stranger Things is a speedy ball of energy. We get to see Sunspot in action, but on the whole, I really don't have that much to say about it. It's a horror movie that's fairly forgettable, with some good bits in it, like Anya Taylor-Joy fighting a demon bear in the Upside Down, or the Slender Man that terrorized the mutants. If you're a completionist of the X-Men franchise, I'm sure you've seen it. If not, you're not missing out on a whole lot. But hey, it's better than 3 other entries. That's gotta count for something. At number 9, X-Men The Last Stand is somehow the best Dark Phoenix movie, and history has been kind to this one, as it's generally more accepted and not shit on as much, because it doesn't deserve to be. It's far from great, but it's got enough going for it. Its main drawback is its 2 main plots, and the fact that it has 2 main plots: the mutant cure and the Dark Phoenix. Having those 2 clash and impede on each other's runtime in the movie never lets each one fully develop. And it's not a very long movie either, so everything ends up rushed. One of the best parts of this movie is Kelsey Grammer's Beast. Excellently cast, incredible makeup and prosthetics, and while I don't mind Nicholas Holt's go at it, this feels like the true Beast, at least closer to the one we see in 97. I'll be using 97 as a frame of reference a lot, because that's probably the closest thing to the comics that I've seen. Also, it's just the best thing ever, so a very appropriate benchmark. In fact, this Beast was so good, we're probably going to see him in the MCU in some larger capacity as teased last year, because the biggest strength of these early X-Men films is the cast. I will mention Ian McKellen's portrayal of Magneto throughout this video as much as I can, because his theater background is so utterly perfect for this character that he elevates every scene he's in. Probably the best cast part of any X-Men movie. So while the cast is great, not every character portrayal is, such as Cyclops, who gets nothing to do in this trilogy, but especially in this movie. He's reduced to cannon fodder for Jean Grey, who is also quite pathetic in this, as she's reduced to, ooh, I'm angry now, I'm the Phoenix. Maybe the storyline just isn't meant to be adapted. The entire detour of the Phoenix is really what holds the whole thing back, and with how much this trilogy was focused on the question of mutant integration into society, the mutant cure surely seems a far more fitting plot to follow. One of the best parts is at the beginning, where you find out about the cure and Rogue gets excited and Storm gets all defensive. You won the mutant lottery! She can't even touch anyone without killing them. What about Porcupine Guy? I'm surprised he doesn't want to get the cure. What can he do? Hug people to death? The writers really have to stretch their imagination for these movies with dozens of mutants present. It's been long enough that things that may have been big complaints, such as
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
seem so insignificant. Like, yeah, he's the Juggernaut. It's one line in the movie. It's been ridiculed, maybe overhated. It's a passable X-Men movie, and a not so great conclusion to this 2000s trilogy. 9th best seems appropriate. At number 8 on the list is The Wolverine, and much like The Last Stand and a few of these other middle tier movies, I've never had any strong feelings towards it. Whenever I do happen to rewatch these, it's always the bridge between the 2 really good reboot movies that I think, I might as well, but I never look forward to it. But the movie starts off with a pretty incredible sequence of Logan surviving an atomic bomb being dropped on him, showcasing just how fast his healing is. Upon which he wakes up, gets recruited, and Wolverine Goes to Japan can begin. And that's a very solid pitch for a movie, and it leads to some great action sequences, which are the strength of the movie. For the most part, that is. And although I typically despise this trope and superheroes losing their powers because they always get them back, so why even bother? Wolverine losing his healing works a lot better because suddenly the movie has some emotional stakes to it, a la Logan. And of course it leads to that great moment where he does of course get his healing back and pulls the katana out of himself. Although the action highlight of the film would have to be the bullet train. A lot of creativity on display, even with the moment for some comedic hijinks. And it looks convincing enough at the same time, with all the buildings whizzing past in the background, which should be a given, but you know how things are nowadays. So now it actually feels impressive when you see something like this in a slightly older movie. On the story side of things, it's fine enough. It's nothing worth making much note of. It covers a few themes and lays some of the groundwork for Logan, which is probably one of its most important feats. Up until the third act, it is a good movie. There's certainly nothing bad that I would point out, other than the Jean Grey dreams. I could really do without those. But then comes the climax, and it's far from the worst thing you'll ever see. Hell, it's not even the worst Wolverine movie climax. But up until now, it's been a fairly serious tone, Wolverine versus ninjas, and now he's fighting Megatron, and it comes off as very silly. I'm sure it's a very prominent character in the comics, but much like Apocalypse, it deserved a better portrayal than an old geezer in a real steel suit. Overall, this is not a bad movie, and it's almost a good movie. The best thing it did was allow James Mangold to tell a greater story in a later movie without using said movie solely as setup. And the post-credits scene for Days wasn't bad either, so it's very much middle of the road for these movies. At number 7, we have the one that started it all, X-Men. And the absolute worst thing I can say about this movie is that it was made in 2000, and that it's one of the first superhero movies post-90s Batman. They were trailblazers in their own right, along with films like the Spider-Man trilogy, then Batman Begins. These were huge foundations for the superhero genre as we know it today. They were still figuring things out, but one thing they definitely had figured out from the start was Charles and Eric, and having them cast inexplicably perfectly, well, that's half the movie right there. They didn't do as great a job with a lot of the other characters, especially Cyclops and Rogue, and I have always really hated Rogue in this. It's a good thing we have 97 now, because she's probably my favorite character in that show, and I'm sure I'll watch the original series at some point, but I've always disliked her in this. Cyclops is another victim of lack of any substance, but someone like Mystique fits into this movie perfectly as a femme fatale type character. So I guess they're 50-50 on which characters they handle somewhat well or not. Again, I'm far from a good source for this kind of thing. But of course, perhaps the most iconic casting in Marvel history is Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. His best work as the character comes much later on, and we're sure to see a fresh take in Deadpool and Wolverine, but his portrayal, along with everything else in this movie, set the groundwork for all future X-Men movies. But simply because it was made at the time it was, and how influential it would end up being, that doesn't simply wave away all the things that have aged very poorly. To save everyone's time, although this video isn't saving anyone's time, I'll list it off. We already covered poor characterization and how it's been done far better now. The black leather suits are awful as is. Certain CGI bits towards the climax are awful. Fight scene physics leave a lot to be desired, and the infamous piece of dialogue.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
But on the whole, it's a fairly enjoyable movie. The interactions between Wolverine and Professor X as we're introduced to this mutant world through his eyes. Anytime Ian McKellen speaks, I wasn't around to see this movie's release and the cultural impact it may have had, but I see its influence now, and it's a very fine movie. At number 6, we have the first Deadpool, and I was very much around to see this one because it was everywhere, and it made a whole lot of money, and the threequel looks poised to do even better. I was a little worried that it wouldn't hold up compared to 2016, like at all, but I was pleasantly surprised, but not by all of it. The movie starts as perfectly as a Deadpool movie can. Great R-rated action, funny moments, not laugh out loud funny, but funny enough, some extremely loose and vague X-Men connections. The movie has all the momentum in the world, but then we cut to the before, and my viewing brain does the equivalent of this while the movie trudges through the origin story crap. And it's not a terribly portrayed origin story, we've just seen it done a million times at this point, and Deadpool doesn't offer anything fresh. Even in 2016, this was by far my least favorite part of the movie, so it's not a new complaint I suddenly have. And this cutting to the origin happens several times throughout the movie, and it's very frustrating every time. When Deadpool is being Deadpool, I love it. They nailed the suit, Ryan Reynolds is killing it, action is actioning, and it's where the strengths of the movie lie. I simply have no interest in Wade Wilson as a character, and that's just how powerful this cartoony Deadpool side of the character is, so let's focus on that. And luckily, they are certainly heading in that direction. If I were to make a prediction for Deadpool and Wolverine, within 5 minutes of the movie starting, Wade will be in the TVA, away from all of that. That's my hope at the very least. In short, the first Deadpool was a monumental moment for comic book movies, R-rated ones especially. It features great action and good enough comedy to help it get by. It just happens to have an incredibly uninteresting half plot, but that other half is really enjoyable. And at number 5, we have Deadpool 2. Why is Deadpool 2 ahead of Deadpool 1? Mostly for the exact reasons I mentioned why I don't love Deadpool all the way through. We don't have to bother with the origin crap, and there's significantly less Wade Wilsoning. And even when it is ugly man under the mask, he's interacting with likable characters like Colossus and Warhead instead of only TJ Miller. There's even a great gag regarding the confusing X-Men timelines. Not having to deal with the origin story crap, instead we jump straight into the David Leitch directed action, of which there is a lot more in this movie, another positive for the sequel. The opening montages, the prison break, the prison truck sequence, it's all an upgrade, which is thanks to the first film's box office success. Being a sequel, it introduces a lot of side characters through the X-Force, one of my other favorite aspects of the movie. Earlier I mentioned how the writers really have to stretch their imagination when dealing with a large number of mutants. mutants, and X-Force is a great example of doing just that and taking the piss out of it. It results in a great The Suicide Squad-esque scene of everyone getting killed off, because that's where the strength of Deadpool lies, making fun of his own movie genre and specifically the X-Men movies, and it never feels overdone. For now, I'm ready for an onslaught of Disney-related jokes.
Disney brought him back. They're gonna make him do this till he's 90.
Other side characters like Domino make for some creative sequences, but another highlight of the movie is Josh Brolin's Cable, the perfect stubborn, angry, one-expression character for Deadpool to bounce off of, and their Hobbs and Shaw-esque prison break is yet another highlight of the film. Essentially, they took everything that was great about Deadpool, cut a lot of the Wade Wilson side of the film, and improved on nearly every aspect. If all things work out the way I hope, Deadpool and Wolverine should follow this same trajectory. We're in the big leagues now, the upper tier X-Men, Marvel, and general comic book movies, because at number 4 on the list is X2, sometimes X-Men United. And for the longest time, I didn't understand why this was a highly regarded X-Men film. I thought it was a very average movie, not even as good as the first X-Men. And I have to say, I must have been smoking crack, because this is a sensational comic book movie. This movie and everything in it is the absolute peak of everything good about these early X-Men movies. From the opening scene, this movie is a different beast compared to X-Men. Aura is a word thrown around a lot in the online space today. Well, no X-Men character has more aura than Nightcrawler. And if you put him in a scene with a Mystique, well, that's double aura. It just didn't translate as well in Apocalypse. One of the greatest openings to any comic book movie, setting up mutants as a serious threat by having Nightcrawler attack the White House. And by 2003 standards, it's very impressive from a VFX point of view. That initial scene sets the tone for the rest of the movie, allowing for a more serious approach, which in turn makes way for Brian Cox's Stryker to be maybe the best non-Magneto villain in any X-Men movie.
I have you beat, you morons!
There's not many to choose from, but it's Brian Cox. He'll always deliver. Having that relationship between him and Wolverine adds that additional depth and mystery to the film, and especially the third act with Logan having flashbacks to his creation, that relationship is another highlight of an already stacked climax. The greatest strength of X2 is in its ensemble and where the story takes the characters and act, even if Cyclops gets the shortest end of the shortest stick once again. Because what is better than Magneto fighting the X-Men? Magneto fighting alongside the X-Men. Especially the Ian McKellen portrayal of it all, and he, like everyone else, is at his best in this, but then again, you'd be hard-pressed to find anything at which Ian McKellen isn't at his best. He literally pulls the iron out of a guy's blood and stands on it menacingly, one of the coldest things you will ever see in a comic book movie. The X-Men also get a chance to shine, especially Wolverine, who gets his first real go at the Protector role, which he will grow into more in future movies. And it makes for some great comedic bits, with the attack on the school being another highlight of the film. The whole movie is one big highlight because it's the ultimate X-Men movie. Even though there's 3 films ahead of this one in the ranking, it's the closest thing we have to a live-action version of a 97 episode. The team's all there, they're involved in big action sequences, teaming up with Magneto to stop a mutant genocide. I don't know why I didn't appreciate it before as much as I do now, but I'm glad I came around because it is an iconic comic book movie, especially for the time it came out, and the fact that it still holds up so much, it'll be a good benchmark for whenever the 3rd iteration of the X-Men come to the big screen. Taking bronze and this X-Men ranking is another movie that is worthy of the title of Ultimate X-Men movie, that being first movie to bridge the 2 timelines, even though it's really a reboot, doesn't matter. Days of Future Past is every bit as ultimate and ensemble X-Men movie as X2, but it has the benefits of the incredible younger cast joining in. Bridging the past and future through the constant of all these movies so far, that being Logan, is a brilliant idea, and I already love time travel in movies more than anything, and even if that isn't quite as prominent, it really only sets the plot in motion. Brownie points. I'll talk about the many positives of the reboot in a little bit, but Days is such a massive movie. To start at the very beginning, it's a minute part of the film, but I will never get over it. The opening credits sequence with the incredible score always gets me amped up to watch this movie. Another feat the MCU must eventually match. As for the opening 15 minutes set in the future, well, that's probably the other example of the live action movies being close to 97 in terms of X-Mening all over the place. But as great as the future bits are, we're here for the 70s, and for whatever reason, X-Men in the 60s and 70s feels right. It's something to be excited about for next year's Fantastic Four. These are some of my favorite periods in US history whenever they're put to film, and adding the X-Men makes that a whole lot better. As I've said time and time again, the greatest strength of these films lie in the relationship between Charles and Eric, and Days is yet another chapter in those great portrayals, proving once again that Magneto is one of the best and consistently written comic book movie characters. But this is more so Charles's movie, if First Class was Eric's. He doesn't have his powers for a lot of it, which is typical X-Men movie stuff of him getting Professor X'd, but that makes for the necessary character development that takes him from James McAvoy to what would eventually become the Patrick Stewart version of the character. And the fact that it's Logan that brings it out of him, much as Charles brought it out of Logan in that first movie, is a wonderful parallel. Michael Fassbender is as suave with his little hat as he is menacing, with Eric on a mission to ensure the future of his race, and this is probably Jennifer Lawrence's best turn as Mystique, taking a larger role than she did in First Class. And Hugh Jackman is of course as great as ever, but that is only a massive compliment to McAvoy and Fassbender, that in the presence of Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, you're able to steal away most of the scenes, but it is their movie. Logan's more of a messenger along for the ride. And speaking of along for the ride, the introduction of Quicksilver is one of the more perfect things in any of these movies. Evan Peters exudes the perfect man-child energy that bounces off Logan and Charles, and you've all seen his slow-mo scene in one place or another. If they weren't so hard to pull off, I'm sure Dark Phoenix would have featured one, but of the two, I prefer this one, and it was the first one. The first one always gets a little extra credit. They never ended up going anywhere with the father-son thing, but what can you do? Other things that are worth noting: Magneto lifting a stadium, awesome. Older Magneto fighting with the X-Men, awesome. Peter Dinklage, awesome. It's an awesome movie with some awesome characters. This is exactly the type of quality X-Men, Marvel, and comic book movies in general should aspire to be. But at the end of the day, it's only number 3. If Days of Future Past is everything an X-Men movie should be, X-Men First Class is what an X-Men movie can be. Alongside others like The Batman, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Casino Royale, X-Men The Secret Service is one of the greatest reboots of all time. I've talked previously about how the Deadpool origin was uninteresting and borderline unnecessary, but this whole movie is their origin, and it's executed so absurdly perfect that of course it sets the stage perfectly for Days of Future Past to pick up the story. Time and time again, I've said that Charles and Eric are the core of all these X-Men movies, but no movie does that better than First Class, mainly because even with the exterior conflicts that are occurring, the focus on their relationship and differing ideologies never falters. Charles is the ultimate moral, he wants to save everyone he can and appeal to the goodness of humanity, whereas Eric has seen the absolute worst of humanity, and that drives his character throughout the movie. There's a lot of comic book movies, the majority of them don't have good villains, and while Shaw is the main villain of this story, Kevin Bacon turns in a great performance to give us another decent non-Magneto villain. Magneto's journey in this is so well written, it makes me want to stand up and applaud the movie every time I watch it. The glimpse of Magneto, Nazi hunter solo film towards the beginning of the film cemented Michael Fassbender as the perfect casting, but the real greatness comes in the middle of the movie where he teams up with Charles to eventually form the X-Men. Seeing that hopeful side of Magneto, his emotional and physical triumphs throughout the film eventually come crashing down when he's finally able to confront his creator feels so earned with his character, leading to this all-timer of a line.
They're just following orders.
I've been at the mercy of men just following orders. Never again.
Come on, Charles, I know you're a very flawed, optimistic character, but you should have said literally anything else. And James McAvoy is the perfect complement to Fassbender, and as perfect as Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart are, these two, especially in this movie, are my Professor X and Magneto, but we're incredibly lucky to have two great sets of them. Now, earlier I called this X-Men The Secret Service due to its many similarities with Kingsman The Secret Service. Seemingly enough, this was a trial run for Matthew Vaughn's future movie, same composer as well, but whatever you want to call this plot structure, packed with young recruits, one of them even kind of looks a bit like me, training montages, global threat villains, spies and shit. It feels so tuned to what I love in movies. Of course, I'm going to love the whole thing. The mutant recruits in this make for a great team, especially with the recruitment montage, leading to maybe the greatest cameo in comic book movie history.
Excuse me, I'm Eric Lyncher.
Charles Xavier. Go fuck yourself.
One of the movie's greatest strengths is its versatility, because it's so many things. Going back to my point that this is everything an X-Men movie can be. Is it a Cold War movie? Is it historical fiction? Is it a spy movie? Is it a revenge movie? It is all of these things and more, and it just so happens to also be an X-Men movie with a fantastic cast, incredible X-Men moments, but most importantly, the best movie adaptation and portrayal of Professor X and Magneto. It's quite easily the best X-Men team movie. I could watch this every week for a year and not get bored. I can only hope that the next reboot is somewhere in the ballpark close to this, and yet, it is not the best X-Men adjacent movie, because at number 1, one. It's the default answer, but for a very good reason. It's Logan. If Days of Future Past was everything an X-Men movie should be, and First Class was everything an X-Men movie can be, Logan is everything a comic book movie can be, if that makes any sense. This is where I put my pretend film knowledge hat on. In a similar way that the Dark Knight or the Batman leads into the noir, the Batman especially with how it becomes this crime mystery coupled with its gothic aesthetic, Logan is an amalgamation of some kind of neo-western, but most importantly a dramatic movie filled with all the emotional stakes in the world. In that regard, it stands alone within this collection of X-Men movies and one of few in the greater comic book movie genre. Being a more loose adaptation of Old Man Logan, a comic book storyline I know next to nothing about, but still good enough to nab a Best Adapted Screenplay nomination, we hadn't seen anything like this. And when the first trailer came out with Johnny Cash's rendition of Hurt, you knew this was going to be emotionally devastating. The Wolverine we've seen in every movie up until now, some more than others, who can never be hurt for more than a few seconds, in a movie where he is constantly on the brink of death, it makes for a more emotionally investing journey than anything that came before. Because it is a journey, not only the road trip part, but the character's journey that came before, with this being the perfect send-off. Logan finally being able to make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of love.
You talk about love?
No, that's the wrong Logan. The many scenes with Patrick Stewart's Professor X, the dinner scene where we actually see a happy Logan for once, this movie hits all the feels. We are very aware of that. I don't need to explain all of it, but what I can comment on is that this is the first R-rated non-Deadpool X-Men movie, and that allows for true Wolverine ferocity. In all of the movies, we've seen Logan hack and slash 1,000 soldiers, but never like this. We're getting another run at it very soon, but this is exactly what was missing from all previous iterations. A truly violent Wolverine.
Because it's so much fun, Chan. Get it?
And if you pair that with the previously mentioned emotional stakes, you get the magic that is Logan. The hype for this film was immense, and I don't know many other examples of a movie where people went to see it knowing exactly how it was going to end and still near unanimously praise it. Hugh Jackman's final portrayal of this version of the character in this movie has gone down in history as one of the best comic book movie performances, cementing his legacy as the character if it wasn't already. With the help of old man makeup and hair, he turns in a performance which is possibly the main factor for this movie working as well as it does. Looking back, I'm more amazed that this movie exists because it feels too much to ask for comic book movies nowadays. I'll mention the Batman again because that provided something of that level. Now Wolverine has joined the MCU and we'll be getting an entirely new rendition of Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, and we have the new X-Men team yet to debut. Maybe by the time you're watching this video, they've already announced Avengers vs. X-Men or something along those lines at Comic-Con. DC looks to be heading in a million different directions. We'll know soon enough what the future of the MCU holds, but Logan will go down as one of the few comic book movies that truly transcended the genre, and that's exactly why it belongs at the #1 spot in this ranking. Man, that was a lot of yapping. If you're somehow still here, do leave a comment saying
Never again.
But it's a big time for these movies and characters, so it felt appropriate. Deadpool and Wolverine might already be out by the time you catch this video. I hope it's as good as we've heard. The future of the MCU kind of hinges on it. But if you did enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know what your favorite X-Men movies are, who your favorite X-Men characters are, what are you looking forward to seeing in Deadpool, Wolverine, or the new X-Men iteration in the MCU, and I will see you in the next one.
Logan, my tolerance for your smoking in the mansion notwithstanding, continue smoking that in here, and you'll spend the rest of your days under the belief that you're a 6-year-old girl. You'd do that? I'd have Jean braid your hair. Welcome back.